Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class we will learn a sort of extra class to Tosfos Divrei Maschil B'Shegeg Leikan Sua. Basically, when we learn this Gemara, the Gemara told us that one of the ways of explaining the two brises that argued, or one said that if a person extended his hand out into Rosh Hashanah, Asalach Zir, he can't bring his hand back in. He has to keep it out there. He can't bring the item back in. And the other brise said Mutalach Zir is permitted to bring it back in. One of the two ways of interpreting the brises is that the one that says Asalach Zero is referring to a case where it was B'mezid. He extended his hand outside B'mezid, so we gave a knas that he can't bring it back in. He did it on purpose. And one is B'shegeg, he did it by mistake, and therefore we allow him to bring his hand back in. The Gemara said that this interpretation of B'mezid Kansua and B'shegeg Kansua is completely unrelated to the question of Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. Rav Bibi Bar Abaye had a question: if a person puts bread into an oven, dough into an oven on Shabbos, and then he wanted to remove it so it doesn't come into an Isser of Shabbos, the question was, do we permit it to remove it or not? The issue is that it's Asr Midrabanan to remove bread from an oven on Shabbos. So do the Rabbanan remove their Isser so that an Isser D'Oraisa doesn't develop or not? So the Gemara says that if we interpret the two brises, that B'mezid Kansua and B'shegeg Kansua, then we don't have any indication about the question of Rav Bibi. And we're going to basically look at that in the view of Rashi and the view of Tosfos, because it would seem that we do have information about the question of Rav Bibi. So let's see how it plays itself out. We're going to do it in a chart form. We'll present Rashi and Tosfos, B'shegeg and B'mezid. We'll go through Rashi first, and then we'll go through Tosfos. So we have Rashi and Tosfos. We have the cases of Shegeg. We have the case of Shegeg and the case of Mezid. So first, let's put down the background information that influences the results. The background information by Rashi is that Rashi holds that if an individual extended his hand out B'shegeg and we wouldn't allow him to bring it back in, he's for sure going to drop it. Since the consequence is only Isser Chatas, not an Isser Skila, and to keep one's hand out for such a long time is very difficult, he'll certainly drop it. That's a done deal. That's a given. Another thing in Rashi is that Rashi holds that it's not such a big deal if the Rabbanan wouldn't put an Isser and they would allow him to bring his hand back in. Since there was no Isser there in the first place, they're simply not imposing an Isser. That's not such a big deal. However, if there's already an Isser in place, like by the Isser of removing bread in the oven, so that's a much bigger deal to remove that Isser. So considering these two pieces of information, what it does is first of all they link the two, that here he'll for sure drop it, that means he'll for sure come to Isser Chatas, just like over there by the bread in the oven, he'll for sure come to Isser Chatas because it's going to bake. That's inevitable. And the second piece of information actually separates them. The second piece of information says that if Chazal don't impose a fine in our case, it's not indicative that they won't impose a fine over there, because not imposing it over here is not as severe, because they're simply not going to put something new, whereas over there they'd have to remove something. So considering these two pieces of information, it comes out as follows: that if here it's Asr, then for sure by Rav Bibi it's Asr. If over here Chazal went and put an Isser Midrabanan, although the person will lead to an Isser Chatas, so certainly over there they'll leave their Isser in place, although the person will come to an Isser Chatas. However, if here it's Mutter, and we don't impose a fine, we allow him to bring his hand back in, it doesn't indicate anything about by Rav Bibi. Maybe over there we left the Isser in place. So basically, according to this, it comes out that when we said that B'shegeg Kansua, that in Shegeg they permitted him to bring his hand back in, doesn't indicate that over there Chazal will allow him to take out the bread. Maybe over here, since it's not a big deal, we're just not going to impose a new Isser, that's why we didn't do it. But over there we have to remove an Isser, that we're not ready to do. So the case where we said B'shegeg Kansua doesn't indicate anything about Rav Bibi. How about the case of Mezid? We said B'mezid Kansua, if he did it B'mezid, he put out his hand, we're going to put a knas in place, even though it's going to lead to an Isser Skila. So why don't we say that by Rav Bibi as well? We'll leave the Isser D'Rabbanan in place, even though it leads to an Isser Skila, in the case where the person put the dough in on purpose. Do we have information from here onto Rav Bibi? It seems like we do, and the Gemara says we don't. So for that, we have to present the points of Rashi, which is he'll for sure not drop it. According to Rashi, if we impose a fine on the individual that extended his hand up and Mezid, and we tell him he's not permitted to bring his hand back in, he'll hold it the entire Shabbos. By Shegeg, he'll for sure drop it, because at worst he'll come to an Isser Chatas, and it's too difficult to hold it. But by Mezid, he'll come to an Isser Skila, he'll make sure to hold it the entire Shabbos. That being the case, if it's Asr here, like we're saying, B'mezid Kansua, it does not indicate that over there we're going to make it Asr. Maybe over here we made it Asr, simply because we know it's not going to lead to an Isser Skila. But over there, if we keep the Isser in place, it'll lead to an Isser Skila. We might not keep the Isser in place. So to summarize Rashi, from the fact that over the case of Shegig, we don't give him a knas, doesn't indicate that by Rav Bibi, B'Shegig, we won't give him a knas. Since over here, not giving a knas is simply that Chazal will make a new thing. They won't make it also, we'll let him be. Whereas over there, it would necessitate that the Chazal remove an Isser that they're not ready to do necessarily. And the fact that we give a knas by Mazid, and we tell him to leave his hand out, even though it might lead to an Isser skilla, doesn't indicate that over there, we'll leave the Isser in place, even though it'll lead to an Isser skilla that the bread breaks. And the reason is, because over here, it most certainly will not lead to an Isser skilla, according to Rashi, because the person will make sure not to drop it. Whereas over there, it's out of his control. He put the bread in the oven, it's going to bake, it's inevitable. There's nothing he can do about it. Now let's look at Tosfos. Tosfos holds, just like Rashi, that he would also for sure drop it, b'shegig. However, he disagrees with Rashi. He says there's no difference between not putting a shvus and taking off an existing isser. In other words, Tosfos says that if Razal won't impose a shvus, they won't impose an isser on the person to bring his hand out, they'll let him be and allow him to bring it back, then they'll also take off their isser. There's no difference between the two of them. That being the case, if we made it usher here for the person to bring his hand back in, then we make it usher there as well. And if we made it mutter here for him to bring his hand back in, we'd make it mutter there as well. So we could learn from here to there. So how come the Gemara said Peshegig Likon Suam, we can't learn anything to Rav Bibi? We have a very clear limit. The Rabbanan allowed him to bring his hand back in. They didn't give him a knas. They didn't impose their isser. So also over there by Rav Bibi, they'll remove their isser, because Tosfos says it's the same thing. So therefore Tosfos says that the case that they said that it's mutter is referring specifically when he extended his hand out in the day. So he didn't do anything terrible. He didn't do a big isser. There's nothing wrong with putting one's hand out in the day. The only problem is that he left it there after Shabbos began. But his actual act of extending his hand out had no isser. So therefore they allowed him to bring it back. By Rav Bibi, it's an entirely different question that's being discussed. It's when the individual did an isser. So there we might leave the isser d'Rabbanan in place, even though it'll lead to an isser chatas. And what about by Mazid? So Tosfos says by Mazid, he disagrees with Rashi here as well. So we have a second disagreement. Number one, in the Shegig, that he says there's no difference between imposing a shvus and removing an isser d'Rabbanan. And the second one is that Tosfos says that by Mazid also for sure drop it. It's too hard to keep his hand out. And that being the case, once again, the Mazid over here is going to lead to an isser skila. So if Chazal will allow the isser skill to develop, that means in the case of Rav Bibi, they'll also allow the isser skill to happen. They're not going to remove an isser d'Rabbanan. So we could learn from here to there. So if that's so, how can we say that we can't resolve the question of Rav Bibi? And the answer is that over here, when they did it, it was only in the daytime. And even though if they do it in the day, if they find a person in the day for extending his hand out by Mazid, they certainly need to find the person who did it at night, because doing it at night is much worse. Nevertheless, since the fine by night is only because they were forced to, they only wanted to find the person who did it in the day. But since that's totally illogical, it's kechucha v'atlulo. It makes no sense that a person who extended his hand up and Mazid during the day can bring it back in. We give him a fine. A person who did it at night, we'll allow him to bring his hand back in. He did a much greater issur, the second person. Of course we have to give him a knas. But since we didn't want to give him a knas, it's just that we're forced to, because it would be illogical not to, so it doesn't indicate anything about the case of Rav Bibi. In the case of Rav Bibi, we were not forced to give him a knas from some outside external factor. It's just a question on its own. Will Chazal allow an issur skill to develop or not? We have no information about that. So to summarize, we'll do the Rashi with Shegig Mazid and Tosfos Shegig Mazid. According to Rashi, B'Shegig, the fact that we allowed him to bring his hand back in, that's because Chazal are not going to go ahead and impose an Isser, whereas to remove an Isser that they might not be ready to do. And by Mazid, according to Rashi, the fact that they told him he has to keep his hand out, that's because it'll never lead to an Isser skilla. The person's going to hold it the whole Shabbos. Whereas by the case of Rav Bibi, where it will, then maybe they'll remove their Isser. So we have no indication, according to Rashi, not B'Shegig and not B'Mazid. And then Tosfos Shegig and Mazid. According to Tosfos, the case where we could learn Shegig from Shegig. So how come we see that they allowed him to bring his hand back in? That would show that they allowed him to take out the bread. Tosfos says it's only referring to the case that he extended his hand out in the daytime. Since there's no Isser involved, they let him bring it back in. We're not talking about at night. At night it's possible, we'll say it's mutter, possible usr. We have no information about that from our brisa, and therefore we have no information about the case of Rav Bibi, which is also that he did it on Shabbos. And then for B'Mazid, according to Tosfos, the fact that we didn't allow him to bring his hand back in, so it would indicate, even though it will lead to an Isser skilla, it would indicate that we don't allow him to take out the bread, even though it leads to an Isser skilla. And Tosfos explained that that's not true, because really we wouldn't give him a fine over here, B'Mazid necessarily. Maybe yes, maybe no. We have no information. The only reason we gave him the fine when he did it B'Mazid at night is because since we gave it to him in the daytime, we're compelled to give it at night. But if the question would just be, do we allow an Isser skill to develop or not, We never had that conversation, therefore we have no information about that, and therefore the question of Rav Bibi remains unresolved.